Okay, fine. My name is Jürgen Bruns-Berentek. I'm Chief Executive Officer of HafenCity Hamburg GmbH. And you might wonder why a capitalist is coming here in view of the fact that you are talking about from a critical capitalist perspective. Well, the reason why we initiated together with HafenCity University, this program roughly 3 years ago, was that we want to initiate a critical dialogue between different types of knowledges. The sphere of knowledge of the university, but you also know when we're talking about experimental development of knowledge, about all the aspects which are related to urban transformations or societal transformations, then we are talking also about ideas which in principle have a critical background, that they are naturally instrumental in a certain way and are becoming, so to say, embedded in a new capitalist strategy again, is very well known to us as members, so to say, of everyday actors in praxis outside HafenCity University. But I like to urge, naturally, everyone to look also outside, to use the critical perspectives, also the theoretical perspectives, also to look into the critical praxis of, so to say, the urban environment, the urban processes, the urban ideas. And I think that is the main goal. I could basically cite a very important one, so to say, the fundamental issue is not to think differently, but to change the things which are around us. And that is our attempt we are trying to pursue in a certain way. And I'm glad that the organizers, that in this case, student commilitones, took the basic opportunity to progress on the ideas and relate university knowledge and knowledge of urban environments together in terms of architectural praxis, in terms of what should be changed. And I'm very curious, and I'm glad that I can participate at least today as a listener. I'd like to welcome you and promise you provide the foundation for our future funding, if you create, so to say, a critical perspective on what happens in cities and in terms of urban transformations. Thank you very much and have a nice day and fruitful discussion.
Okay, we also have two guests today, which are Tilman Reitz and Simon Sheikh. And in order to give a little introduction to those two, we asked them before, like, which was their motivation in order to do the research in their topics. And for Tilman, it was that when he studied, his aim was to, when he was like, okay, as soon as I am a professor, I want to like criticize, especially these excellence initiatives, and because that was something that also very like triggered him, and he's. Möchtest du noch was sagen? Okay, and he's also now active in the network for good work. in the academia network for good work. Yes.
And for Simon Sheikh, we asked him, and he said that because he is in the system kind of the universities and of teaching, and he realized how the commercialization was going on in all this, and he wanted to change that, and especially moving between Europe and the UK, he realized that there are the big differences, and as he said that in the UK they're totally in the system already, in the commercialized system. And that was his motivation to kind of change something about that.
Okay, in the beginning we would like to play a game with you guys, and we have one question for this game, and our question is, how many term papers have you written since you started your studies, and who wrote more than 10? Okay, you guys can move to the first class, and the other ones, please. No, term papers.
Ja, jetzt sitzt kaum jemand, aber hey. Ja. Okay, perfect. And we'll continue our game after the first lecture. And I would now like to introduce Tilman Reitz as the first lecturer. Or is it the other way around? I have no idea. Okay, then we'll start with Simon.
Hi. So, yeah, we discussed, Tilman and I, just briefly that maybe it was better that I start, because I find whenever I speak on the continent these days, it's very depressing what I have to report from the United Kingdom and the British Isles, particularly in terms of education policies and reforms. So it's usually a very sad story. But maybe what's useful and what can be learned from it is that the English are extremely ambitious in their ideas of how to finance and how to regulate education, and have been driving for the last 25 years at least the idea of education as a business through the European Union. This has been heavily opposed for a long time from France, who believes that education belongs in culture, not in business. So already there is a major distinction. We do no longer have that distinction. The university where I work, which is Goldsmiths, which is part of the University of London, we no longer have a research department. We have something called research and enterprise. So you can see how the two are just connected in the terms of the language. Particularly the plans they have for students basically paying for their studies rather than having governments paying for them, which is something that fits in very well with certain ideas of neoliberal deregulation and certain ideas of austerity, is something that they really feel that they have cracked. So maybe I'll talk about that a little bit in a while. So one of the things you can say is that in terms of reform and the reforms that are ongoing all across Europe, and that the Bologna process, I don't know how familiar everyone is with the Bologna process, but the Bologna process has been heavily implicated in this. But all those sort of reforms of commercialization, privatization, and deregulation, there is a huge ideological interest in, have been fully implemented in the United Kingdom. So we are total new liberal subjects. We have nothing left from the subjectivity of alternative ways of thinking, social democracy, or even liberal humanism. Those ideas of education have been abandoned. So we're on the other side of the reform. So this is what you're going to get if you continue down the path in the rest of Europe that we've been through. So that's also why it's sometimes a little bit depressing to talk about. So the ideas behind the reformation of education has been to make it more competitive and to have different ways of measuring what makes a university productive, and it's very important that it's productive. So what has happened is a gradual and now almost complete removal of state funding to education or directly to the universities. You can still get some teaching subsidies, some research grants, but the latest figures, I checked them that I could find for coming here from 2015, the state funding overall for the university higher education sector in the UK is 5%. I would say it's probably even less now. This was 3 years ago. So 5% is basically the funding that comes from the government or from the state system. So where does the rest come from? It comes from two places. One is association with industry. And through that, research grants, etc. This is a fairly small section. The main section is tuition fees. And the tuition fees now, the universities have been allowed to raise them to £9,000 a year for what's called home and EU students. So that also means European students until further notice. Because at the moment, of course, the European Union rules apply that a European student, a member, someone from a country in the European Union cannot be charged more than a British person. So that can be at the maximum at the moment of 9,000 a year for a master's degree, which is quite a lot. Obviously, it's still cheap compared to the American universities. But as an overseas student, which means the non-EU students, it's basically double that amount. So this scheme has been very important. It's been introduced gradually. They are now trying to have a two-tiered system where the institutions that do not score as high on the various models that we are evaluated by, basically what's called the NSS, the REF and the TEF, wonderful abbreviations, all of them. Depending on how high you score on that, some universities will lose the right and the capability to charge the full fee and will have to compete by being cheaper. That's the idea. Of course, no university now want to admit that their academic standard, their employability of their students, all the rest of it is lower. So everybody has gone from the outset from the highest possible tuition fees. Again, it depends on which course you have. So if you look at the fee log on my college, you'll see it's different depending on what course you study. So this, of course, means on the one hand, the obvious, which is that you have a complete change in the social backgrounds of the students. So you have less students from minority backgrounds, you have less students from working class backgrounds, etc. The students tend to come from the upper and middle classes. I would say a lot of the students where I teach are not from rich families, but they come from academic families because their parents are willing to mortgage their house to pay for the education of their offspring. So we have this strange social reproduction where academics that are not from the upper classes are children of academics, so it becomes like a clergy. You can imagine how this will be 50 years from now if this system continues. So that's one issue. So of course what the government has done is to introduce a loan system that's highly favorable for the students, for prospective students, particularly for BAs, less so for master's degrees, but for bachelor degrees, because they don't really think you need more than a bachelor. So you can get extremely lucrative loans. It's probably the best loan you can get. This is very important to remember, because this is the model they want to export, because they think they have cracked the Gordian knot of how to finance education when the revenues of a modern European country can no longer afford to do it. That's the argument, that's the idea. We can no longer afford to do it the way we could afford it before, but we know that education is important for our future, right? So there's this strange contradiction that on the one hand, education is something we cannot afford for your generation. We could afford it for the baby boomers, of course, as the same way we can afford pension for the baby boomers, but not for anyone else. But for your generation, we can't afford it. But at the same time, it's important that you educate yourself so you can become a specialized workforce in order to pay for the pensions of the baby boomers who also had a free education. So this is the kind of generational theft that's of course happening at the moment. So the loans are extremely lucrative, and if you are not employed after 25 years, the loan disappears. The government covers the loan. So in many ways, it's important to remember there's a lot of politicking, a lot of activism around the fee structure. This is seen as the main crisis, but it's actually not. It's actually not the main crisis. I'll get back to what the main crisis is in a minute. It contributes to the crisis of education, but it's not the main issue, because the loans are so favorable at the moment. Now this might change, because now they are connecting the returns to the loans to your taxes. So they have a full mapping, and they can use, of course, wonderful algorithms, a full mapping of every graduate in the country and how much they've paid back of their loans. And the idea is that in a few years, you can do it not just for subjects of study, which you do now. It's very interesting to look at the graph of the subject of study. I mean, the graphs are a bit, and maybe I should have brought them, I'm sorry, you can find them online. They're a bit misleading, because they only look at people with bachelor degrees. So of course, the capability to get a high-paid job in certain professions would also depend on your master's degree and possible PhD. So they don't have the numbers for those. But in terms of bachelor degrees, you will see that all the students who study medicine and law, they paid back, even way before the 25 years. Art and design has a very, very low rate, particularly among the male students. The female students pay it back more than the male. Very interesting. And then there is one field of study that has a negative return rate, and that's philosophy. So they want to be able to do it not just by study area, but by individual university and by individual program. So you would be able to see, oh, the program in curating at Goldsmiths that I run, or whoever runs it at that time, their students do this and this well. Students in a comparative program do this or that better or worse compared in their capability to pay back their loans, will then indicate their productivity and their employability. So one can very easily imagine what the next step will be, of course, from the government, which is to say you can only get loans for study areas where we get our money back. So if you want to be something creative like an artist or a designer, if you want to be in the creative industries, that's fine, but it's at your own risk and you have to pay for it. You can no longer get the loan. Right? So this is the possible next step. Certainly, if we manage to re-elect the Tory government, that will be the next step in education reform. So this is very interesting, because this is the model that they have been touring around Europe, trying to sell not the last bit, but the first bit, which is instead of giving the students grants, have them pay the tuition fee and give them a loan that's so favorable that they will take the loan. And then this will also, of course, help the banking sector because of the interest rates. So it's an economic incentive to say people have to take responsibility for their education through loans, through a structure of debt, rather than through a commitment to, let's say, an academic study area, right? So this is the plan, and of course, if you look at the favorability of this loan, it's a very attractive proposition to a lot of European politicians across the political spectrum. And then, of course, you can imagine it now, if we have a strong wave of populism, mainly from the right, but also from the left, you could imagine very easily saying, we can implement it in certain steps. We need doctors and nurses, etc. So the state will pay for that. But then we'll create favorable loans, and you might never have to pay it back, for those of you who are in the creative industries. Right? So you can have a tiered system. So this is, let's say, the horizon of possibility that awaits you with this continued education reform. So I said I would talk a little bit about the main crisis. I'll do that, and then talk about some of the issues that we are dealing with as academics and students, also politically, to question these larger structural changes, which do not have so much to do with how we teach, although of course it indirectly does so, because it implements when you from the outset incur a large debt for your education, then of course you also feel a different sense of entitlement and obligation from that university to provide you a service. So it fundamentally shifts the role of mentorship and tutoring to a client-customer model between staff and students. Now, a lot of people find this a very attractive idea, but I would certainly caution against that. What we have experienced, of course, is that the implementation of the tuition fees has created a lot of stress for the students. So the capability for a student, if they're partly dependent on their parents' backing, not just morally, but financially, their capability to choose their field of study themselves, their autonomy is drastically reduced. And of course, the pressure to do well increases. So what we've seen is a major increase in mental health issues related directly to stress and anxiety. Hence the by now famous Plan C manifesto, We Are All Anxious, which I would urge you all to read. I think it speaks well to our contemporary moment. So anxiety has been a major issue. Again, the levels of anxiety and mental health issues among students are heavily skewed in terms of the female students rather than the male students. There are, of course, other underlying reasons for this that we can discuss, but this is the case. So we have, due to those issues, that you not only take a leap by deciding to study something in particular. Maybe you want to study something that your parents don't want you to study, or nobody in your family ever pursued. Add to those pressures the financial pressure. So a lot of pressures to succeed and exceed in such a scenario. Not very conducive for learning. Not very conducive for the idea of learning as non-disciplinary, as emancipatory. Right. Moreover, of course, what we are witnessing is a housing crisis, particularly in London, where I work. The living conditions are extremely poor, and the only growth, of course, the growth area in the economy in the United Kingdom is the housing market in the south and in London, and perhaps the finance market, another discussion. Basically the rents and quality of living due to that, transportation times, puts heavy tolls on students, makes their ability to be on campus outside of class very reduced. So the whole student experience, as they so beautifully call it, suffers due to that. But the main crisis really is the housing crisis, also financially, because there are no loans for that, and rents going up. Also, there are lots of social issues due to congestion and pricing. So lots of students, like a lot of service workers in the city, no longer just have flatmates. They share rooms, maybe with 2 or 3 strangers, which leads to all sorts of social problems in terms of pressure, violence, rape. So what really contributes is this. There's a knock-on effect from the introduction of the tuition fees that leads to these 2 other main crises, which is the housing crisis and the mental health crisis. So these are the things that are the outcome of the privatization of education. Even if you introduce student loans that are favorable. So what can be done about it? Well, I think the first thing that we've discussed is that we have to look at the things that we can affect. Due to the latest green paper issued by the government, which came out 2 years ago, which would even further privatize the universities and try to create a... there is already, of course, a system in place, a ranking, but they want to increase that ranking system. I should also say, just as a side note, this is important to remember as part of deregulation, that people in the UK don't understand that difference, and people in Europe often don't understand that difference. But the deregulation in the UK also means that there is no caps on the number of students you can educate, right? So in most of the European countries, in Germany, in France, etc., there is a political decision made, discussion, we can discuss what's reasonable or not. We need this and this many doctors, we need this and this many designers, this and this many architects, this and many urbanists. But there is a discussion, so that many places are offered, right? And you then gain a place, presumably, on merit. Again, this is how it's supposed to work in principle, right? So you get a place on merit. Now, when you deregulate, anybody could start a whatever subject if they can get their university to sign off for it in terms of the academic content, and if you can then get students. And there is overall in the sector a student staff ratio, which is 1 full-time post for 20 students. That's the calculation. So of course you can start all the programs you want. You can start it in the same study areas as other universities. So this is the kind of competitive structure that's there. So that's why there are so many art schools. People often ask me, well, how come there are so many art schools in the UK? This is the reason. Because anybody that can attract students, then you have to deal with later on if the students complain and you have a bad reputation. This happens a lot. And then courses don't get run. If there are some courses get closed for 1 year, maybe 2 years, and then completely, if they do not recruit, as it's called, right? So again, it's only the kind of market mechanisms that regulate whether you can offer a course or not. So that's an important thing to remember, that this is why we have such a huge sector. And there is this driving ideology that the sector is a business. But anyway, in response to the latest report from the government, there was a group of both from technical staff, from academic staff, and from students. We drafted something called the Gold Paper, which was an alternative version of what a university could be. some very simple demands. For example, that we would get to elect the warden, which we don't now. That we get to elect someone to every council on the university, which we don't do now. So our influence is drastically reduced, of course, and so just to say that students and staff should have a say in who basically runs our university. Anyway, it was a very long document, so the council was not really sure how to deal with it and said, could you identify 3 main points, which we did, which was interesting. Now, that dialogue was a bit stalled because we had a major conflict last year, so all the universities in the UK were on strike principally. Lots of course, academics and departments didn't strike, but most of us did. And again, this is when we strike, we don't get paid, and we don't get any, you have to apply for help from your union, so most of us simply just don't get anything. So it's extremely expensive to go on strike. But we did, and now our warden has stepped down, so everything's a little bit in limbo. But anyway, we said that the first thing that the higher education sector has to acknowledge is its responsibility in the mental health crisis that affects universities, and be able to. So we had a discussion with he's also left now, the head of the well-being center, as it's called. And he said, yeah, I understand the problem, but could we call it something else than a crisis? A crisis sounds so negative. And we said, well, we really think this is a mental health crisis. So, and what they have done after being called the Wellbeing Center is that they have got rid of most of the mental health workers and instead now offer well-being classes, so which is exercise, yoga, things like this. So that we want to turn around. But these are one of the things that we can, of course, control, because it's not that the Wellbeing Center is cheaper now than it was before. So these are the things that are within the control of university, and those are the ones we have to start with. I'll come with one utopian model at the minute and also say why it failed, and end with that. But so the second thing is housing justice. So our university have student halls. So instead of running them themselves, they outsource them to a private business that have renovated them. As far as I know, they were pretty squalid before, but they were also cheap, and of course raised the price insanely and are making a huge profit on that. So our demand is that the college takes back the halls and run them on a non-for-profit basis. That would be a major help to students. So I think these are very realistic demands, And the third one was that we democratize the whole governance structure of the college, which basically means that we get to select the warden, not the council. That nobody who sits on our council can sit on more than one university council. So there are certain people, lords, this or that circulate, gets lots of money for sitting on 10 to 15 different university councils. So that had to be stopped. And then we get to elect the not just the warden, but the pro-wardens, etc. So those were the demands. Now, we also had a more utopian one that I hope we will continue working on, which is to say, what can you do if you're completely dependent on tuition? If you're completely dependent on that economy. So one thing is, of course, a macro-political fight, which is to hopefully, by having a different government, reverting the system of tuition fees. This is possible, but difficult. It's very important to remember that tuition fees in the UK were introduced by the Labour government, not by the Conservatives. So this was in the first year of Tony Blair's reign. He introduced tuition fees. They were very small at the time, and then they have just increased since then. And it's very interesting. Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London, who has been a politician for 40, 50 years, happens to be good friends with John Major, who was the conservative prime minister that before Tony Blair, and he apparently called up Livingstone, and you can write about this in you can read about it in Tariq Ali's book because he knows Livingstone. So John Major is from a working class background. He calls Ken Livingstone and says, you know, every year I've been the prime minister, the finance guys came into me with a plan to introduce tuition fees and told me how much money we could save and how much money we can accrue for the banks. And I told them to get the hell out of my office. You guys have been less than 1 year in office, and immediately you introduce tuition fees. So it's difficult because we have to then make the Labour Party no longer the new Labour Party, because they were the driving. So it's very difficult when the party that should be speaking on behalf of the working class of social justice are the ones that drive new liberal reform, right? So this is a complication in the macro political fight, but it's there. On a micro political level, what you can do is to accept that you're a business, but then discuss what kind of business you are and what kind of business model you want to have as a university. And of course, there are business models that are not necessarily based on accruing large profits for their stockholders, but that are actually there to create a sustainable economy for the people who work there. And in this, I would also include the students. And this is the model of the cooperative. So what I think we could do, and there's no legal reason why we can't do it, because we're privatized, is to change the university into a cooperative, so that when you pay your tuition fee, and part of your salary as an employee goes into co-ownership of the college. And then, of course, you can have a governance structure that follows that. And then as you leave, the same way if you live in a co-op, you can't sell it for profit. Right? So you're not a shareholder, you're a co-owner. So that's a model, of course, that was used to be what drove the business structure to some extent successfully in former Yugoslavia. So it's not that there aren't historical models for cooperatives of factories. They're also now in a lot of squatted factories in Greece and in Latin America. So if we take the model of the cooperative and use that as the university, as the answer to the other side, the end game of neoliberal privatization, that might give us some possibilities to exist in a hostile environment. So I'll end with that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for this first lecture. We'll change some seats again, maybe. The next question for you will be what kind of A-level, Abitur, or high school degree you got, and we wanted to ask which one of you is better than 2.0. So, okay, I think 2.0. Okay, let's change some seats.
Ja, wir sollen noch sagen, was wir danach diskutieren.
Okay. Jetzt direkt? Nee, nach dem nächsten Vortrag, ne?
Nach dem Vortrag wird diskutiert. Nach der
Okay.
Zeit wird diskutiert.
I think we'll head over to Tilman Reitz, and afterwards we'll have a little good discussion with you, if you'd like. Just stay.
Okay, thank you very much. While this should start, I can, say that it will be very interesting first to compare the German system and the UK system, because it's really different. We have avoided tuition fees, and that is due to student protests. So it was really a major political fight, and so to say, the good side won it. So what I will present is other consequences of this in Germany. Okay, it doesn't work at the moment, but yeah, it will take a while. And the other thing is that, of course, we will have to compare both of our models of the general university or higher education system to your specific situation. So I won't talk so much about art schools, but about, higher education in general with the model of the university. And even there we have some kind of competition-based system in Germany now. And some people even call it academic capitalism, but it's something rather different. Well, it's said that great. So you even see my agenda now. Well, then I can also present you my title. It is about capitalist knowledge regimes. It's also about the environment, about the market economy within which a higher education takes place, and then the competition-based university, how I would choose to call it. I will first give you a note on the economy of knowledge, information and culture, and I hope that it somehow also applies to what you are supposed to do professionally at one point in your life. And then I'll talk about the debate on academic capitalism and which reasons there are for calling it that way, even if it's not as dramatic as we just heard from the UK. Then I will talk a bit more about how higher education serves capitalist needs, and we will see that it's not only by turning the university into a market or into a business that's possible. And I will talk about pseudo-markets or quasi-markets, which actually do rule higher education and academic research, even in Germany, which is very public in other respects. I will also talk about some not so nice specificities of the German system, which I would call feudal heritage. So we have very strong hierarchical relations at our universities. We have a kind of hyper-exploitation because people are so idealistic in a way. Even Max Weber talked about that. And we have some kind of status hype. We have that in the UK, we have that in the US, but we also have it in the German system. People tend to want to have the most prestigious publications and the most prestigious grants and so on, and the system really forces them to want to have them. And I'll end with, some kind of optimistic perspective I'm not so sure about after I heard Simon speak, but I think there are some British-German exit options from the system. So we can combine not only the worst, but also some better elements. My first note should be short. It's if we live in some kind of society or economy which can be called cognitive capitalism, knowledge economy, etc., then I think we have a basic problem. How to make money from public goods? I think that's really a problem, because knowledge and information and culture, very many cultural products at least, are non-rival. So they are not used up when you use them. So why should anybody own them when it's economically more rational to let everyone use them? And exclusion from them is largely ineffective. So it's very, it has its own costs to exclude people from using your knowledge and information and so on. And sometimes it's even impossible. Think of scientific results. Scientific papers are public in a way. So everyone can access them, and they are supposed to access them because they should be quoted in other papers, and so on and so forth. So that's a very public good. And the idea is, how does capitalism manage to deal with this kind of goods? It's also with films and also with architecture. I mean, everyone sees it. Maybe you're not allowed to enter, but it's there in public space. The standard idea is that capitalism manages to deal with these goods via intellectual property. So you just say it belongs to someone. You have that film, everyone could have a copy, everyone could watch it for free via the internet, but then you have all those agents and laws, and well, it's a crime to watch it if you do not pay. So that's the fundamental idea. And people like Bob Jessop did believe that this is how cognitive capitalism works in general. I just read the quote to you. Just as wages are the market price for the use of labor power, just as rent is the market price for the use of land, and interest is the market price for the use of money capital, so we can interpret royalties in different forms as the market price for the use of knowledge. So that's a cultural model. Royalties are tantiemen. So it's the thing you pay when someone enacts your song or your play you wrote, and so on and so on. So that is in the eyes of Bob Jessop the idea, in that royalties in a different form as the market price for the use of knowledge as a commodity. This price must be paid when the application of knowledge to the production of immaterial goods and services becomes a distinct function within the division of labor, and all such functions are rewarded through market mechanisms. So it's an interesting model you can also apply to teaching, but I'm not sure whether it really applies in every part of cognitive or informational capitalism. Because I think, and other people have started to think too, that there are alternative solutions. I think one of the main solutions is that you have specific services like teaching, which do take time and where it's very easy to exclude people. They just can't enter the room where you teach. You just don't correct the papers and so on. So exclusion is very easy and it's not such a public good. So specific services, and also lawyers do specific services, or analysts in the financial market and so on and so forth. And then there are, of course, the quasi-monopolistic informational services of Google and Facebook and dating platforms and so on. So it's this is very, very this does really need a large audience, and there are those networks effects. So the system lives by a large audience. But the basic idea is only that platform has the monopoly and thus can offer that service. Everyone uses that dating platform, and then it's fine for that dating platform. So these are other ways to make money out of knowledge and information. And then there are, and this is very important for universities, status hierarchies in knowledge and information work. You all know that from lawyers and doctors and so on. If they are very, very famous, if they have a reputation of doing really good work, well, then they have high fees. And they are very, very, they depend on their fame in a way. And it's also that entering the profession of a doctor or a lawyer or things like that has high boundaries before it. So it's really, really a problem to become a doctor. You have to go to the university first. And that's how they select people, and that's how they keep the fees and wages and income high. So that's another model to make really money out of knowledge. And then, and I printed this in another color because I think this is what the university does, you need low-cost public knowledge and you need status provision. In a competitive design, I'm not sure if that's necessary, but what cognitive capitalism needs is really, you have all this knowledge and it's provided at the most low cost you can imagine. And then you have also a system which provides status so that you can justify or just enact your hierarchy. You can say, well, I'm the famous lawyer who studied at Harvard or Princeton or Yale. And then I can take very high fees, and your law firm really makes advertising with this, and so on and so on. So I think that's part of the way, academia serves cognitive capitalism. I think all of this, maybe that's not so important, it's rather theoretical. It's a strange reversal of the theory of the fictitious commodity, which stems from Polanyi and which is also a concept that Jessop works with. The idea of the fictitious commodity is, well, the product is a commodity. So labor is not produced as a commodity, labor force, but somehow it's used in the factory and it becomes a commodity. But I think much of our scientific results stay public. Everyone can read the articles, everyone can work with the results, but they are produced as if they were a commodity. So the whole process of production is organized as if it were capitalism, but it's not real capitalism. The state still funds universities, there are still people who are working and do not produce profits also at the universities, but they somehow act like they were in a capitalist enterprise. So now we are touching the debate on academic capitalism. I think a lot of market elements have been introduced to academic life since the 1980s and 1990s, particularly in the UK and in the US, but also in other countries. And I just give you a list. And I also give you a list to show in black what is really capitalistic or really market mechanisms, and which is something else for which we don't have a term yet maybe. So you have new patent rights in the US. You have startups, firms growing out of universities, and you have technology transfer, so people want you to do that. But it's often not cost covering. So these technology transfer offices cost more than they earn, or so that's at least if you're not at Harvard or Berkeley. Another thing is tuition fees as a main financial source of higher education. We heard a lot about it, but at least in the US, it's mostly tax subsidized. So the state still pays for the university, but it gives people the opportunity to have attractive loans or give them stipends, and so it cross-finances the university as a profit-making enterprise. So it's a very interesting model. It looks like capitalism, but it's something different. Then you have those things which have to do with competition and are not so much really capitalistic, but they also feel very much like capitalism. It's performance-based and contingent funding in academic research. So you don't just do research, you have to apply to get funding to do your research. And there is, of course, competition to get your funding. You have rankings and league tables as a public medium of competition. Many of you know it, know that the Shanghai ranking, for example, or the Times Higher Education ranking, where you can see, well, my university is number 3 or number 6 or so. You can't see that if you're in Germany because we start at number 45, I think. And then you can also see, well, I'm among the best 100 or best 200 at least. So these tables are obviously also a medium of competition, and they are relevant for tuition fees and things like that, but it's not quite the core mechanism of capitalism. Then you have the managerialization of academic units and institutions. I think that's very strong in the Anglo-Saxon countries, and it's a bit less strong in Germany, but we have a trend towards that. That not the scientists decide what they want to do, but the people who calculate the monetary and the reputation profits they want to earn with your university or academic unit. The problem is, in many of those cases, you have no additional profit, at least not in the system as a whole. You don't even have cost covering in the system as a whole. And so it's problematic to define academic capitalism. What should capitalism without profits be? You can see that very clearly from Sheila Slaughter and her co-author, who first say, well, we do live in an academic capitalism, and then explain the difficulties. So why is it something like capitalism? Well, they say research, education, and the non-academic experience of higher education become commodities. But then they say, speaking of new fiscal realities and championing the need of entrepreneurial academic capitalism, presume that most such efforts generate net profits. They do not. So I think that's really the defining problem, and I would be interested if the whole sum of things, of money that the British state, for example, invests in the universities is really dramatically sinking or only, well, incrementally sinking. In Germany, it's not sinking, it's stable, and that's the problem because we have more students now. And then they have another idea about it. They say, rather than conflating privatization with the reduction of public monies for higher education, we explore how privatization shifts public subsidy toward particular private interests in the post-industrial economy. So it's not that the state invests less in education and higher education, but the profiteers are other people now. So that's the real change. I make this here very short, although I have lots of theory invested in that, but it's not so interesting for us, and I want to get back to the university. We can resume what cognitive capitalism needs from the sector of higher education, and then say how higher education serves that. So what do they need? What does a capitalist economy need from higher education? Of course, qualified workforce, and at best for free. So the firms don't train you, the businesses don't train you, you get some of your basic training at the university that the market doesn't pay for. Capitalism also needs accessible and or appropriable results. And that's very difficult, I won't get into the details, but sometimes it's not so good for the big firms if the small firms have intellectual property, because then the big firms have to pay something. Then maybe there are new markets in higher education because lots of money are running through the system. Markets for paying students or even for knowledge buyers. And then there is this status and reputation part of what capitalism needs. So you probably need a credentialing for posts of capitalist control. So when people have a post in a capitalist firm and they earn lots of money and they really make decisions for lots of people, somehow it has to be justified. And in the US case, they really justify it through higher education now. And they say, well, our people went to Yale, our people went to Princeton, our people went to Harvard, and so they are supposed to know something. And there are lots of interesting research articles, picturing how research, recruitation of those workforce of the higher firms is really working. And it is working. They really recruit their people from there. And those people really say, well, I don't have any specific knowledge, but I was at Harvard, and then there came the big law firm and hired me. So that's really the case. And what higher education offers to knowledge capitalism is very clear then. It's a generalist training for increasing masses, very many people going at the universities with stable public net costs. So maybe they decline in the UK, they don't decline in Germany, they don't decline in the US, but they are stable, and ever more people have to be taught by that. And what the higher education system also offers is research with more or less direct access for commercial use. So startups can grow out of universities, public-private partnerships can be built, and there is public support of R&D, research and development, from national market leaders. So it's very clear, we don't have very much research about public transport in Germany, but we have lots of research directly fitting with the interests of the automobile industry. And of course, some of that is state-funded. So that's another mechanism. Then we have a money-intensive sector with rich institutions like Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard or Yale. And we have high private debt and high public subsidies. And that's the interesting or somehow threatening part of the system. In the US, where the credits, the student loans are not so favorable, student debt in some years surpasses household debt. So it's a really, really mass of indebtedness which comes out of the system. And you have a system that is somehow the point I like most, system of status production. A system of formally autonomous, performance-based hierarchies of reputation, which justify public expenditure, so the state only funds the best and most excellent scientists, which nobilitate employers, so this law firm has only those people from Oxford or Harvard, and they signal superior research, so whenever you have a biotech company and a big pharmaceutical business, you know where your people are because science system signals where the interesting research, for example, in genetic manipulation is taking place. Yeah, and now you have that German case where they don't have so many direct money mechanisms in the system, and still you have lots of competition. And I just want to give you a map of that. And I think it helps to compare different systems because some elements are universal, are general in all countries, and some are specific to the Anglophone countries, some are also specific for Germany. Once again, you have the quasi-markets of new public management. You have publicly subsidized individual education and student loans. We talked about that. You have contingent government funding of research, like the Research Excellence Frameworks in Britain, or the DFG and the Excellence Strategy in Germany. And directly working with that, you have prestige competition in academia and in the media. So scientists really want that prestige. It's really a working motive that keeps them going. They want to have that excellent journal where they publish their article with a high impact factor. So this journal is really, really quoted by other journals. And you have individual citation indices. So how many times does your own article get quoted? And if it's in the last 5 years, if your citation index is very high, then you're really, really strong on the job market. So it's not only a prestige fetish, but it's also that people need that for their careers. You have once again contingent funding, like a big Sonderforschungsbereich in Germany, and the accumulation of symbolic capital. So if a university or department always gets DFG funding, that must be an excellent and really, really great institution. And then you have rankings, once again, and league tables, government-driven, like in China, Shanghai ranking, or media-driven, like the Times Higher Education. And now I think this is the most interesting thing. You have interlinked strategies of maximizing symbolic and monetary capital. So you do have competition, and you do have people who now want to strategically position themselves within these competitive settings. So you have excellent strategies not only of countries, but of individual universities and of faculties and of departments. They all want to be the best. They all want to compete. They waste lots of money because they want to win in the excellent strategy and wherever else money and fame is to be had. And then you have a new academic management, which is really, well, aiming at this financial and prestige success, which go hand in hand. So if you're very high as a business school, for example, there it was researched, if you're very high in another ranking, then you also get this capital of student fees, and then you also get government money, and so on and so forth. And I think young researchers and scientific projects are mostly in this system disposable assets. It's nice to have them. It's very good to have projects at your university. It's brilliant to have young researchers who are brilliant. And then you can make fame and prestige capital and real capital with this asset. And then after a while, at least in Germany, you decide, well, you don't need all of them. Some of them can go away, look for other jobs, and some can stay, but it's only 5 or 10% who can really stay in the system. The other wrote their dissertations, worked some years at the university, and that's why I say disposable. Then you can kick them out of the system and say, yeah, well, that was that. Thank you. And you have, as the backside of that, an academic star system with overused names at the top. So very many important scientists are giving talks like that every evening and saying every evening just the same. I mean, I found it completely disappointing to listen to Charles Taylor or Spivak or even Derrida, because they just had to talk so much in public spaces because every university wanted to speculate with their symbolic capital and say, well, we have that star here, not only for an evening, but for 3 weeks. And so they can show them, but that's all they are then. They are just show objects who enlarge the symbolic capital of the place that happens to pay most for them. Yeah, well, in Germany you have then, and that is maybe important for you, at least for the young scientists, but also for the students, you have a kind of German Sonderweg. And I think maybe we should still talk of academic neo-feudalism or even a courtly society here, because we have virtually no tuition fees. And we have virtually no increases in public expenditure, but we have renewed traditions of quasi-feudal dependence. If your professor, for example, has a lot of research projects, then he doesn't have only 3 people who depend on him, but 40 people. I have a professor in mind at my department who is some kind of feudal lord of that kind. So that is really a new dependence. And you have a strong tradition of idealistic self-exploitation. So people want to do science, they really want to do it strongly. They say, well, those years of precarity are okay because I will be a famous or good scientist in the end. Or at least I will try to get that chance. And you have a massive introduction of quasi-markets for research and prestige, which makes the feudal system change into something like new feudal system. Is there academic capitalism in Germany, or what is academic capitalism in Germany? I think that's really interesting in comparison with the UK. I think, yes, there is academic capitalism, because the good or miserable university budgets hinge on competition. So if you're successful in all of these competitions, which I just tried to picture, then you have a good budget. And then you can do a university as it were in former times, with free research and somehow okay seminars and not too many students and so on. But if you don't win, if you lose, and most of the universities lose, then you really have a problem of, for example, serving the needs of the students and having enough time for each of them. Yeah, and I think there is also academic capitalism, but in a feudalized sense, insofar as prestige competition is even more central here than elsewhere. So if you call that capitalism, this competition for reputation, then you can also apply the term. And you can also say high levels of exploitation usually count as characteristic for capitalism. Can you still hear me? Yeah. I think. Yeah, and so I think that if you say, well, that's a decisive characteristic, then you also have academic capitalism in Germany, because we have really, really high exploitation rates at the moment in our system. The only problem is, of course, slave labor is also exploited, feudal labor is also exploited, so maybe it's not so characteristic of capitalism only. It's only the outcomes that are monetary that are somehow more characteristic of capitalism. And I think there is also one respect in which we don't have academic capitalism here. No, insofar as tuition fees are not central, and insofar as managerial incomes are still low. You have university presidents in the UK and then especially in the US who earn between 300,000 and more than €1 million per year. You don't have that here. And you have also that other managers who have really, really high incomes, really, really much decision power. And that stratum of administrators is simply not so strong as far as yet in Germany. And this is the reverse side. You have really nearly no rights of the scientific employees, so that's also non-capitalistic, but there are also only rights against the employees. So if you have worked 6 years or 12 years or something like that, you can be fired, or you have to be fired because your university would then be threatened with a permanent contract for someone who is not professor, and no university can afford that. I mean, there are some rare marginal cases where it works, but usually universities don't do that. So we really have some kind of labor law which is working against academic labor below the professorial level. What would be the exit options? And that's my last slide. I'm sorry for having talked so long. Maybe a combination of what I perceive as in principle not so bad in the UK, and a combination of what was good in Germany before these reforms. So what is possible with real employment relations? I think what would be possible is a democratic department system. You have lecturers and readers, you have permanent positions, which are not professors, they have permanent contracts, and they are not personally dependent on the professors. So that would be simply a good step and a big step in civilization in Germany. The other thing is you could organize at your department a cooperative planning of research projects. So if it's clear your department has that and that money, you don't compete for money, you simply have it at your disposal for research, then you have to discuss about what research do we do. And then you have to make collective decisions. And you could organize flexible changes between research, teaching, and self-administration for the academic employees. So you can say, well, the next 5 years I do want to do research, and then I want to concentrate on teaching. And self-administration is taking so much time, I will make that my focus for the next 3 years or so. So that would be another possibility for a democratic department system. And what you can, well, this is the German conservative part of my talk, what you can also cultivate or could still cultivate is local diversity and equality versus courtly centralization. There is no need to force hierarchies between the top universities and the middling and the regional universities, how they call them. You could simply say, well, it's all good higher education and let's see where something really interesting develops. It's not pre-decided that it has to be in Berlin or Munich or Bonn or Hamburg. And you can concentrate money in rare cases where you really have high-cost research. But in many sciences, you don't have high-cost research. So everyone can, with the same monetary means, can get to excellent results. But it's not a case of money. There are some natural sciences where we really need those big machines. And there are some parts of the social sciences where we really need to make big research projects to collect data. But it's not the normal case. And you should simply have an equal basic funding according to student numbers. That is discussed in German politics, and I think that's a simple and workable, practicable model. And what you also need, and this is the, well, either utopian or Scandinavian part, you need a transparent and self-conscious way of spending tax money for public goods. So if I said what I said in the beginning was right, that knowledge and information and culture are public goods, then you need ways of raising public money for that and spending it in transparent ways and not playing the market. I mean, you don't have to simulate markets if it's simply not a market thing what you're doing. So I think that could be changed, and even with basically something like the amounts of money which are in play, maybe a bit more, that would be the Scandinavian part, but I think stop simulating markets would be a first step towards responsible higher education. I think I can end here. Thank you.